PC gaming in the 90s was a real interesting moment for the industry, where it wasn't uncommon for experienced developers to quit their jobs at established studios to start their own small companies, giving them the freedom to create what they wanted and push boundaries in the industry that large companies wouldn't dare. One of the most famous cases of this was id Software, where John Carmack, John Romero, Tom Hall, and Adrian Carmack decided to quit their jobs making games with soft disk and create their own studio that would change gaming forever, pretty much creating the FPS genre as we know it today with 1992's Wolfenstein and Doom in 1993. However, this video isn't about it, but instead on a programmer that they hired during the development of Doom, Dave Taylor, who was not pictured here because he was late to the photo shoot. God damn it, Dave. Dave joined id Software fresh out of college and was doing whatever programming John Carmack would throw at him. While he never got the same amount of fame that some of his colleagues did, the work he did there still had a pretty significant impact on the industry. Most notably, Dave decided to port Doom to Linux during the game's development, pretty much just because he wanted to. Now this might not sound like a big deal, but when id decided to release the source code for Doom in 1997, they got caught up with some legal issues with their former sound coder, Paul Raddick, who allegedly would not let them release the source code publicly due to the DMX sound library he developed for the game. Fortunately for the world, Dave's Linux port did not have any legal issue with Paul Raddick's sound code, so the first release of Doom's source code to the public was Dave's Linux port. So next time you boot up HDream, think about how this guy made it possible. Anyway, Dave Taylor stuck with id Software, but like with most of the classic id lineup, the difficult development of Quake fractured relationships between a lot of the staff there. Most notably John Romero, who left id Software to make Iron Storm with Tom Hall. Dave was also thinking about leaving the company during Quake's development, but instead of joining Romero, he was thinking about doing his own thing. He asked his bosses at id if they were okay with him starting his own studio and working on a game while they finished off Quake. And they said sure, as long as he doesn't code for it while working at id, and as long as he doesn't make a 3D game like Quake. So Dave got together with an old college friend by the name of Jonathan Clark and they started crack.com. Yep, they named their company after crack. And that is the drug they named it after, not the term they used for cracking games at the time. Why? Well, because video games are addicting like crack. Anyway, they quickly made a pretty solid engine for themselves and decided that they will make a side-scroller for their first game. And that side-scroller was called Abuse. Abuse is a run-and-gun side-scroller developed by Crack.com and published by EA Games in North America, and in Europe it was published by Origin Systems. Interesting enough, there was also a port for Mac, which was developed by Crack.com employee Oliver Yu, and that version was published by none other than Bungie in March 1997. In Abuse you play the role of Nick Vrenna, an inmate at an underground prison that performs medical experiments on its prisoners with a substance called abuse, turning its victims into fearless, deadly, violent mutants. A prison riot breaks out and the substance is leaked throughout the prison, mutating all the inmates apart from you, because you're a special person who's immune to it. You quickly find some battle armor that you equip, and you set out to stop the substance from infecting the water supply, blasting any mutant or machine that gets in your way. How do you manage to get access to battle armor in the middle of a prison riot when you're an inmate? Well, that's not important. Also, how do you know that the water supply is spreading abuse throughout the prison? Also not important. Why should we care about a clearly throwaway story in a mostly forgotten game that didn't have a huge impact on the industry as a whole? Well, I only really bring it up because the story was actually changed very late in the development of the game. One of the demos for Abuse originally shows that there was an alien species called the Ants that were absolutely destroying the humans in a war, and were now offering humiliating surrender terms that probably included admitting that you shouldn't have left id Software. You still played as Nick Vrenna, but instead of being a falsely incarcerated prisoner, you are now a commando infiltrating the ant space to hopefully push them back to where they came from. Apparently the story was changed because the whole lone hero going into an alien base to take them all down was generic and overdone at that point, but at least it fits. The developers obviously didn't really care about the story too much, so why did they change it at all? Especially to something that's just worse at the last minute. But before jumping into the game, it's important to talk about how to actually play it these days. There are two main ways to play the game today, one being the DOS version, which is most likely the one you'll be downloading if you go to any abandonware site, and the other being an SDL port by Antonio R. The biggest difference between the two is the game's frame rate. Abuse is designed to run at a very smooth 15 frames per second, and if you dare go above 15 frames, the game doesn't behave like it's meant to. You may think that I mean it becomes a buggy mess, but no, the differences are subtle enough that you probably won't even realize anything is wrong and the game is just designed that way. But the game is harder. I beat the DOS version of this game without realizing the FPS issue, and only after I started writing this review did I find out there was a problem with how I was playing the game. If you're playing the DOS version of Abuse, you can play around with cycles and settings in DOSBox or DOSBox X to try get it running at a steady 15 frames per second, but it's a bit of a hassle, and there will probably be times where the frame rate goes into single digits if you do that. Fortunately, Antonio's SDL port is freely available to download. Not only does this port do a good job of capping the FPS, which gets rid of that whole issue, but it also rebinds the keys to a more standard keyboard layout, ditching the arrow keys for WASD. It's a great port, and I highly recommend playing the SDL version over the DOS version if you're thinking about playing Abuse. And I'll leave a link to where you can download it in the description, along with any other links with info I used in this video. After the intro, you will launch into the game with a quick tutorial level which quickly shows what sets Abuse apart from other run and gun side scrollers. Mouse aim. No longer are you limited to where you can and can't shoot by controls. In Abuse you can shoot in any direction you want, and you will need to with how chaotic enemies are in this game. This may not seem like a big feature, but mouse looking games was a pretty new idea that was popularised by Quake, and it was probably most likely where Dave Taylor got the idea for mouse aim, considering he worked on Quake just before Abuse. I couldn't find any side scrollers that had mouse aiming released before Abuse, and even after its release, free 360 degree aiming in side scrollers was still a pretty rare sight all the way up until the late 2000s when Flash games and indie developers started creating more side scrollers again. After the tutorial level, Abuse really just throws you into the action. You're going to be running through the infested hallways filled with mutants, blasting everything that comes into contact with you. It really is a unique run and gun shooter from the time, and its fast paced and chaotic gameplay is a lot of fun, especially at the start as the game eases you into its mechanics. However, Abuse lives up to its name. The game is hard. Brutally hard, and you will die constantly from the volleys of lasers, grenades and rockets that are thrown at you, or even ambushes you weren't properly ready for. While the game is brutally difficult and at times feels pretty unfair, it does thankfully have a forgiving save system in the game. The levels have terminals littered all over them that you can save at. You respawn at them with full health, and thankfully the developers were nice enough to put them absolutely everywhere. So pretty much every difficult section that might kill you over and over again in Abuse will have a save point right before and after them. There are a few moments in the game where they may be further apart, making you have to go through a few gauntlets before reaching a much needed terminal, but those long sections aren't super common. Fortunately, the game does give you an absolute arsenal to deal with the mutants and robots that you're going to be facing going through these tunnels. You start with a laser rifle, which is good enough for dealing with low numbers of enemies. If it runs out of ammo, you can keep firing but at a slower fire rate. After that is a grenade launcher, which we will be swapping to often when the laser just isn't cutting it. You can also find a rocket launcher in the tutorial level if you keep an eye out for secrets, but I would recommend holding on to the ammo, because you're going to need it in the later levels. The rocket launcher really is the weapon you'll be relying on the most, particularly when the enemy count starts getting insane. Its heat-seeking rockets make quick work of anything coming at you, without requiring perfect aim. That is, unless it decides to lock onto something that you don't want it to, which sometimes results in your unfortunate death while relying on it a little too much, just enough to keep you on your toes. Later on, you're going to get a napalm launcher, which is really Abuse's super weapon, killing just about everything in front of you instantly. But ammo is incredibly limited, so you really want to save it for sections you just can't make it through without. Fortunately, the game also gives you an energy rifle, which is basically a fast shooting laser that hit scans, making it one of the most useful and reliable weapons next to the rocket launcher. Outside of those, you're going to get a death saber, which is essentially a chainsaw on crack, jibbing anything it touches. Ammo for it's pretty hard to come by, and it does go through it pretty quick, so much like the napalm launcher, you might want to use it sparingly. Lastly, there is the Novasphere launcher, that throws out these explosive frisbees that will just float around for a bit before locking onto a target and dealing huge AoE damage. Its ammo is pretty rare, and it's not on par with the napalm launcher or the death saber in terms of damage done, so I didn't really find myself using it too much. But it is far from being useless, and it can come in clutch if you have been hoarding ammo for it. Fortunately, there isn't really a cap on how much ammo you can hold for any of these weapons, so you won't feel pressured to use ammo to pick up more ammo that you might come across. Overall, Abuse has a decent variety of weapons that you'll be constantly switching to and from depending on the situation you're in. I was pretty much using every weapon, including the starting laser rifle, all the way up until the last level of the game. As for the enemies that you're going to be using these weapons on, you're going to be running into a lot of mutants, robots and turrets constantly in the prison, and they will be ambushing you at every opportunity they get. Everything in this game is a trap. Every switch you press is going to unleash a swarm of mutants on you. If you see any ammo laying around, chances are you're about to use it straight away on a bunch of mutants that come out of the walls, or robots flying down from the sky. Even the health packs, where you might think the game is giving you a break, are most likely going to end up taking more health than they give. You're going to learn this by the first few levels, and the constant ambushes will not ease up until the very last level. You can die fast in this game if you're not prepared for them. If you let the mutants get too close to you, they will shred your health quickly, so you need to be quick and accurate as they do everything they can to close the gap while firing at you. Their movements are pretty chaotic as they move towards you, randomly leaping around or clinging onto ceilings, making it hard to hit them without area of effect weapons. Add to that the constant screams and ambient sounds coming from them, and the gameplay feels really fast-paced and intense, which is an absolute blast when you get into it. The sound design was all done by Bobby Prince of Doom fame, and a previous colleague of Dave Taylor at id Software. The OST may not be a metal-inspired soundtrack to rip and tear demons to like Dooms, but it is a decent looping sci-fi MIDI soundtrack, with some tracks having a bit of a hint of dread and urgency to them to keep you moving. There may not be any super memorable tracks, but it fills its purpose. It doesn't distract you from the gameplay, but it's not completely forgettable either. The sound effects, on the other hand, will not leave your mind if you play Abuse for a while. The mutant screams as they leap out will etch itself into your brain. If the game is going to throw 10 mutants at you, it's not afraid to play that screaming sound effect 10 times laid on top of each other. So it just blasts your speakers or headphones and shreds your ears if you have the volume up just a little bit too high. That being said, the ambient sounds playing as you run around absolutely nail the atmosphere. You will hear creepy low-pitched groans echoing through the halls, mutants scurrying through the walls and vents looking for you, until they finally decide to leap out screaming as you quickly start firing everything you have at them. It really adds to the feeling of isolation and loneliness as you run around the prison, or space station, whichever one it was meant to be. It's kind of hard to tell with the visuals of the game, to be honest. Abuse's visuals are definitely inspired by Alien vs Predator. Mutants really do just look like xenomorphs. Nick kinda looks like a predator in his combat armor, and the Juggernauts, Flyers, and levels all fit the visual style of the Terrans from Alien vs Predator. Despite the visuals not being entirely original, it does all look pretty good, especially for a side-scroller released at the start of 1996. The sprite work is pretty detailed for the time, and the animation on them is pretty solid. The way everything moves around fits the overall presentation, so nothing really looks choppy or out of place. While the levels look a lot more like a spaceship than a prison, the textures used for the environment sets a solid foundation for Abuse's isolated and hostile feeling, which the audio and gameplay just enhance further. Most info on where you are in the game is really told by the background art, whether it be a mutant hive, a tech industrial area, or the middle of a city filled with skyscrapers. Aren't we meant to be in an underground prison again? Not that it really matters though, because you'll be spending most of the game paying attention to metal corridors with enemies coming at you from all angles instead of the backgrounds. Being a game set inside an overrun prison with an Alien vs Predator theme, you may expect Abuse to be really claustrophobic with tight corridors that limit your mobility, but the levels actually offer up quite a bit of space for you to maneuver in when combat kicks off. There certainly are moments where you may find yourself in a narrow corridor with a horde of mutants barreling towards you, but the crack team doesn't throw those at you very often, usually giving you open spaces to jump around in, letting you avoid taking hits from waves of projectiles that are heading towards you. Often these rooms are linked by narrow corridors where you could easily be ambushed, but the game shows restraint in throwing anything too difficult to deal with in those spaces, which does a good job of stopping you from getting too angry at the game for throwing cheap shots at you. Unfortunately though, the enemy variety in this game is very low. You will spend most of the game fighting off mutants which all share the same sprite, only with different colours telling you which weapon they're using. And by the later stages in the game, that pretty much just means that 80% of them are yellow mutants that will fire volleys of missiles at you. Aside from the mutants who have to deal with stationary turrets that fire different things at you depending on their colour, but these can also be used to kill the mutants if you lead them into the firing line. Aside from those, there are flying robots that buzz around you shooting at you, drill bots that don't appear often but just fly directly into you, ripping you apart if you don't kill them in time, and juggernauts which just kind of stand there, lobbing grenades at you. Sometimes they'll move towards you, but usually they just stand still. Dumb idiots. Unfortunately, the lack of variety means the fun, fast-paced, intense gameplay starts to get pretty stale as the game goes on. By level 5, the game has pretty much shown you everything it has to offer in terms of enemies and weapons. While the game is still enjoyable, it pretty much just ups the difficulty on each level by throwing bigger waves of enemies at you at every ambush spot, which means every room just turns into a hall of explosions the instant you pick up something or flick a switch. The game does try to keep things fresh with some scripted events, and even some encounters that require you to do things a little bit differently, but they are so far between each other that you often don't realise what's actually going on. There was one moment in particular where you enter a room filled with enemies, and after a short time some robots would come out with a napalm attack and instantly kill you. It was maybe after 6 attempts that I realised the instant kill robots would only come out if you killed some other ones that would be flying around when you entered the room. While the whole concept of having to fight a bunch of enemies while being careful not to destroy other targets isn't an inherently bad gameplay mechanic, this is the only time it really does anything like this. And you're pretty far into the game when it happens, so you really have no idea that it's going to throw something like this at you, and it never happens again. As soon as you're through with this room, it's back to killing everything on sight. At least, that is the case until the last few levels where the game throws so many enemies at you that you have to drop the gun part of run and gun to get around the hordes of mutants. Unfortunately, again, the game up until this point has not really had many encounters like that, and it doesn't really communicate to you that you shouldn't be trying to kill everything on sight, making you feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall all the time. However, not all these moments are bad. Towards the end of one level, there is a short elevator fight that ends with a hallway filled with explosives that you need to rush through. A swarm of basic mutants are going to do all they can to stop you from charging in. I don't know if you can get through that section without at least one napalm blast saved up. First time I got to that stage, I only had one ready, and it took me almost a dozen tries to get through it, and even then I felt lucky. Another level later into the game has a similar concept where you essentially need to speed run through a series of halls before everything blows up, killing you instantly. It's a fun level that changes the gameplay, and ends before it drags on too long, which definitely makes it stand out from the other later levels in the game. Even some of the more brutal segments that at times can feel unfair are super satisfying when you do manage to get past them. Like I mentioned before, there's pretty much always a save terminal immediately after any seriously tough section, so once you are past it you can unclench your jaw and breathe a sigh of relief when you get through it. This part where you have to flick a switch, run from these mutants, and get out of this pit by quickly platforming across missile turrets had me rage quit after a couple of attempts. As the missile turrets come online to shoot you, they easily knock you off back down, and when that happens it's basically an instant death. On top of that, they easily destroy the turrets that you need to get out of the pit, so you have to do it in one quick, clean attempt. It may not look that hard, but the jumping in this game does feel a little janky when you're on top of turrets, because the edge isn't super obvious, and the up arrow key is what you use to jump instead of spacebar, which makes jumping a little bit awkward. But once you manage to get out of that pit and hit that save terminal that's right there and you know it's there, it really does feel like a huge victory, like beating a difficult boss at the end of any other game. Speaking of, Abuse lacks bosses throughout the game, aside from the very last level, and it's really high up on the list of underwhelming bosses. It's basically just 2 scaled up mutant sprites with a whole lot of health that slowly teleport around the room, changing colours to indicate what weapon they're going to shoot at you. What really sucks is that one of those weapons can be napalm, which instantly kills you if it touches you, and the colour they come out as is almost identical to the yellow that they use when they're about to fire a rocket. So it really sucks when they just decide to hit you with one of those. Your napalm isn't going to kill them instantly, but it does do a lot of damage to them, so you pretty much just want to annihilate one straight away, making the rest of the fight a bit of a cakewalk. Just don't use a death saber on them, because if you kill them with that and you're too close to them, you instantly die in the explosion. Bullshit. It really just feels like a tedious fight that isn't very fun. Dave must have been taking notes on how to make good boss fights while working on Quake, because Abuse's final boss really is on the same level as disappointing as Quake's. It's just kinda there because, well, it has to be there, right? You have to end your game with a boss fight no matter how shit it is. But be careful after you beat them, because you still have one more obstacle to pass, and if you die, you need to fight the boss all over again. Yeah, this caught me off guard and I had to go through the whole goddamn fight again, just jumping around spamming rockets. Now, finally we can divert the water supply and save the world from abuse, and get our glorious ending. You've survived the impossible odds and made it to the control room. By pulling the switch, you have diverted the water supply and stopped the spread of abuse. Congratulations, you're howling! And that's it. Back to the title screen. No escape from the prison or heroic last stand for our hero Nick Renner. Just you sitting there, howling. It's unfortunate that Abuse ends like that. The game starts out strong and really is an absolute blast to play, but unfortunately it just kind of fizzles out. That being said, it has gained a bit of a cult following since its release. It did sell 80,000 copies, which doesn't really sound like a lot in modern day, but given that it was a new IP from a new studio made in 6 months, and only has 5 people in the credits, it was very financially successful for Crack.com. Especially since, according to Dave Taylor, the game actually only costed about $150,000 to make. So this allowed them to expand and work on their next title. But what happened? After abuse, the Crack.com team moved into a new office in Austin, Texas. They hired a bunch of new staff and decided that they were going to ditch having a publisher to fund them, self-funding the development themselves to maintain their creative freedom. After spitballing a few ideas for their next game, they ended up coming up with a title called Golgotha. The team was feeling inspired by Command & Conquer, which was absolutely dominating the PC gaming scene at the time, and had propelled the RTS genre into the mainstream. Crack.com's idea that would set Golgotha apart from all the other RTS games coming out is that it would be a fully 3D environment where you would shift to and from the standard bird's eye view, where you control armies like you do in Command & Conquer, to a first-person shooter perspective like in Doom, where you would control a super tank that you would drive around and attack enemies with. Remember, this was 1996, so the whole RTS FPS hybrid had not really been done at this point, and it definitely was an idea that a lot of gamers and developers were thinking about at the time. For me personally, the first time I'd ever seen the whole idea put into a game was with Dungeon Keeper and its possession spell, which really blew my mind when I first used it. But even that was a whole year away from when Crack.com started working on Golgotha, and it was really just a side aspect of Dungeon Keeper instead of being a main gameplay feature. But trouble started for Golgotha pretty early. Given that an RTS FPS hybrid had not really been done at this point, it meant that they really had to figure out how to get two very different genres to blend together in a fun and organic way. Co-founder Jonathan Clark talked about this in a guest editorial on Loonygames.com in late October 1998, stating that, "In Doom, you're a single character only concerned about your health and what's behind the corner. In Command & Conquer, you are a mastermind global strategist where everyone is expendable, and you only care about how you are doing overall. The two don't work together. It seems obvious now, but we thought there had to be a way to make it work." Unfortunately, the team slowly realized that they were unable to make their vision a reality and decided that they should move the focus of the game towards the first-person tank action, dialing back the RTS elements to essentially spawning minions from your base down a path until they clash with your opponents, while you got to drive around and do whatever you wanted in your super tank. In retrospect, it sounds awfully similar to how MOBA games like Dota or League of Legends work, but the team likened the gameplay to an old Apple II title called Rescue Raiders, where you flew a helicopter destroying enemy targets while escorting ground units that you purchased to destroy the enemy base. Looking back on the game's development in a 2005 Gamasutra article, Dave Taylor states that once the game had found its soul and direction with its Rescue Raiders style gameplay, it was great. But unfortunately it was too late in the development and the company was financially struggling to pay rent and wages. The team did try to get some additional funding with some publisher deals, but unfortunately they just did not secure enough to keep things going. By 1998, their idea of a hybrid RTS FPS was no longer new, and a few games had beaten Crack.com to the punch. Most notable was Uprising Join or Die, which came out in October 1997, as well as Battlezone, which hit store shelves in March 1998. To make matters worse, despite both of these games being received quite well by critics and gamers, achieving a cult status for those that played them, their sales were disappointing, making it harder to get a good publishing deal for Golgotha. Unfortunately, in July 1998, Dave Taylor announced that Crack.com was in deep financial shit and was unable to make payroll. While there were some that were financially able to keep working on Golgotha out of pure passion, those that could not go on without their well-earned pay were sadly let go from the team. The team tried their hardest to get Golgotha finished and released, but you can't run on passion forever. And in October 1998, Crack.com closed their doors for good. In an interview with Ralph Barbagallo, Dave admits he bit off more than he could chew with Golgotha, and that he kept pushing for new ideas, not knowing when to cut things out of the game. The overall failure of Golgotha really was a lack of solid direction, and by the time the team found their feet and where to take the game, they were already running on fumes. 2 years after closing shop, Dave Taylor and Jonathan Clark decided to release Golgotha's source code and assets to the public domain, so you can have a look at what they had going for it. You do need to compile it yourself to try to get it working, and unfortunately I do not know how to get it working at all because I have a very smooth brain and don't know anything about coding. But I did manage to find an old demo online they had released publicly in 1997. Learning nothing as a kid who destroyed multiple family computers in the mid-2000s, by downloading suspicious links from dodgy websites, I didn't hesitate at all to download Golgotha Demo number 5 and potentially brick my PC just to see what it could have been like. I managed to get it working after messing around with it, but there was a few times where it decided not to launch. The demo contains 2 levels, Switzerland and Egypt. It's also at the stage of development where you had to manually control the units that you purchased instead of running them down the preset path to the enemy base. Your goal is to get a single engineering truck onto your opponent's capture pad and stop them from doing the same to you. You have money constantly coming in at a steady rate, and there isn't anything in the demo that I noticed that speeds it up or slows down the money generation, even though a readme says that you can capture banks with engineering vehicles to increase it. The only thing that you can spend money on are the 8 vehicles that include tanks, trucks, kamikaze trikes that you just know are going to be used a lot in the Middle Eastern levels, jets and helicopters that are very good at missing everything they shoot, electric cars which were probably inspired by Red Alert's Tesla tanks instead of actual electric cars that function more like kamikaze trikes. engineering vehicles which you need to win, and finally, the super tank, costing $10 billion dues. Everything but the super tank you purchase in formations, of whatever size you want, and when they leave the construction pad they essentially act as one unit. The AI really does most of the work when controlling formations. You don't really choose what targets your units attack or how different vehicles in your formations behave when they engage with enemies. You just tell them where to go, and if they run into anything they just do what they want. It's not really a bad thing because the AI does a pretty good job of just attacking any enemy that comes into range instantly, which is better than what happens in Command & Conquer, to be honest. But what happens if you mix ground units and air units into the same formation? Oh god! My light tanks! But let's not forget the super tank, given that it is the main feature of the game. Let's see how it operates. It's a mess. Ignoring the fact that it can go up sheer cliffs big rig style because, well, that is an issue that they've listed in the readme, it feels clunky to control. To free look around with the mouse, you need to hold down the right mouse button, and it just doesn't feel smooth or precise like you would expect in an FPS game. Honestly, keyboard aiming feels easy to use at times. You have 3 weapons bound to 3 different keys. A machine gun that auto-locks on the targets bound to 1 on the numpad, your main turret bound to numpad 0, and your big missiles, which you only have 2 of, and you really want to save them for the enemy super tank, is bound to the enter key. Now this wouldn't be a huge problem, but the combat is pretty quick in this game. Everything including the super tanks are destroyed very quickly. So when you encounter an enemy, even if it's just light tanks, you need to destroy them fast or you're going to be going back to base for repair and stock up on ammo, if not taken out entirely, making you need to buy a new super tank, which again is $10 billion bloody dollary dues. The AI is very good at quickly targeting you and hitting you with pinpoint accuracy, so honestly, controlling the super tank just really wasn't that fun at all. Hell, in the Egypt map, I ended up getting spawn killed by the enemy super tank until I ran out of missiles, because of how good it was at just destroying me instantly. On top of being clunky and not very fun to use, you also need to manage your formations, so you're constantly leaving your super tank's view, leaving it just sitting there defenseless while you organize your other units which you need to win the game. Obviously the computer has no issue with that, so I got defeated pretty damn quickly the first time I played. But if this game was inspired by Command & Conquer, then I have a plan to get an easy win on the computer. That's right, old, reliable, light tank spam. Let them waste their money moving their small squadrons and super tank into a wall of small, cheap hit-scan tanks that just keeps getting bigger and bigger before moving it in as one giant death ball that easily destroys their base. Easiest way to win. And I didn't even need a super tank, which really destroys the whole gameplay concept of Golgotha. So that's the Switzerland map of gameplay demo 5 of Golgotha. There is a second map, Egypt, and there's no real gameplay difference here, just a different map, so there isn't really anything to add. It also kept crashing, so I didn't really play it out for that long, to be honest. Now, to be fair on Golgotha, this is a very early demo of the game, but god, it really doesn't give a great impression of how the game may have turned out. I can see how pivoting the game away from the RTS elements into a more proto-MOBA, like mentioned before, would make the gameplay better, as you don't have to focus on managing units while piloting a tank. But the handling of the tank itself really made me just want to play any other FPS. This demo came out approximately a year after development and was pretty much in the middle point of the game's development. It just shows how troubled Golgotha's development really was, and you can even see that in the readme where Dave states, "We've gotten really excited about Golgotha's progress. We feel Demo 5 is a huge improvement over Demo 4. We're seeing the kernel of a damn sweet game in this demo." I mean, after a year of work, I could imagine you would expect to have more than just a kernel of a damn sweet game. Like, seriously. Digging through all the files that were released when crack.com put out the source code for Golgotha after closing their doors, you can see that there were a lot of cool textures and sound effects that aren't bad for the time, as well as all the game's music, which is kinda interesting. Some tracks are actually really good, like Iraq, Cairo, and Turin. But then there's some real weird ones, like Al-Basra and Munich, Germany, that are just kinda strange. I mean, just listen to it. It was all all done by a guy called Gene Rosenberg, who has since done a lot of work in sound design in video games, with probably his highest profile work being on The Witcher 3. But that's all there is to really say about Golgotha. There was a public effort to get the game complete using the source code that was released, but it seems like people behind that weren't able to finish the project off. It's also worth noting that Crack.com also released a source code for Abuse, which is why Antonio Yar's SDL port was possible, as well as the game being available to download and play for free, making it well worth checking out. But what happened after Crack.com with Dave Taylor and Jonathan Clark? What did they do? Well, Dave Taylor stepped out of the games industry for a few years. He never really seemed that proud of Abuse, saying that all he set out to do was prove that he could make a mediocre game that sold more than 50,000 copies. I mean, he isn't wrong, but despite its flaws, Abuse still is a pretty solid game. And while there were a lot of amazing games coming out in '96, there was way more trash flooding the market that Abuse really surpasses. Anyway, after a break from the industry, Dave partnered up with his old friend from id, American McGee, with his new studio Carbon 6. Dave only stayed for a year before leaving Carbon 6, but that doesn't mean there was any bad blood between him and American McGee. In fact, it seems like just about everyone from id that Dave worked with seems to get along with him well. Dave kept working in the games industry doing a mix of programming, consulting, and representing smaller developers. All around, he seems like a chill guy, and it's good to see that he kept going in the games industry even after Crack.com went under. As for the co-founder Jonathan Clark, he decided to get out of the games industry after Crack's closure. In the Loonygames article I mentioned before, that was published pretty much right after they closed the doors of Crack.com, he mentions how he learned a lot about managing businesses through the failure of the company. So, he started a software company called Thinstall, which ended up being bought out by VMware, a multi-billion-dollar company. He decided to part ways with VMware and start another company called Inner Scene, a company that makes fake windows that show realistic simulations of sunny skies. It's pretty cool tech, but goddamn it does feel a little bit dystopian. It is a shame that he left the games industry because he really seemed like he was a super talented programmer. But hey, looks like he made the right choice, and you can't blame the man for that. But that's the story of Abuse, Golgotha, and Crack.com. A couple of developers who set out to make a name for themselves and actually managed to get a pretty damn solid game out that was a success only to lose the direction on their follow-up, leading to their closure. With Abuse being open to everyone, I really do recommend giving it a go if you're looking for something to play. It is a lot of fun in the first few stages of the game, and you might even enjoy it all the way right up until the end. But just be prepared, it isn't an easy game. But it will give you at least an hour of solid entertainment. As mentioned before, I've provided links to where you can get Abuse, as well as some articles I got info on Crack.com, Dave Taylor, and Jonathan Clark. So check it out, and take it easy.